Okay, a few weeks ago, this is my way to classify psychology. Psychology could be viewed as something like a spectrum. On the one end of the spectrum, we treat human beings as machines. So we talked about how this machine perceives the external stimuli, how this machine memorizes things. So in the first few weeks, actually from the beginning of semester up to now, we have been treating human beings as machines. This is just one end of psychology. And on the other end of psychology, we deal with more unpredictable phenomena about human beings like emotion and motivation. So that kind of psychology, this is the way I call it. I would call it like warm-blooded psychology. And for that psychology that treats human beings as machines, I call them cold-blooded psychology. And today is the last week for cold-blooded psychology. Okay. We are going to talk about cognitive processes. Before we go into the details about cognitive processes, this is something I have to remind you. What do psychologists do? We look at human behavior. And for most of the psychologists nowadays, based not only for psychologists but for neuroscientists or even for philosophers, basically we don't deny that there is a physiological basis for any human behavior. A very obvious example is if you have any brain injuries, your behavior will be affected. So of course, any behavior somehow is mediated by the nervous system. So the nervous system is important. But that is not the whole picture of the story, because we still don't know what affects the nervous system. It could be the genes, or it could be the environment, or it could be the free will. We talked about this last week. Okay. Probably some people, they might think that if something has a physiological basis, probably that thing is genetic. But whether a particular thing has physiological basis has nothing to do with that thing is genetically determined or environmental determined. Because even for environment, the environment can shape your nervous system. For example, when you were a kid, you couldn't ride a bicycle. And then you learned to ride a bicycle. Eventually, you could ride a bicycle. Has anything changed before and after you learned riding a bicycle? Of course, something has changed in your nervous system. Something has changed in your brain. And that change is caused by the environment. So of course, the environment will shape, the environment will change your nervous system. When you are learning a foreign language, before you learn it, you couldn't speak that language. And after you have started learning it, you could speak that language. Has there anything changed in your nervous system? Of course, something has changed. So now you can speak another language. So of course, environment is important. Education is also important because environment and education, they can somehow shape your nervous system. But which one is more important? The environment or education or the genes, or something not genes, not environment, something unique to you, free will. We don't know whether free will exists, but this connection, genes, environment, or free will, if it exists, how they affect the nervous system is something harder to solve. So this is the whole picture of psychology. But when people are talking about behavior, behavior is actually a very general term. It includes many different things. For human beings, for us, a behavior could be language use, or thinking, or personal interaction. How do you interact with other people? How interpersonal interactions affect your thinking? or perception, vision, audition, touch, smell, etc. Memory, intelligence, abnormal behavior, attention, decision-making, reasoning, creativity, emotion, motivation. These are all individual human behaviors. And usually, normally, if you take a psychology course or if you look at any psychology textbook, every topic is in a different chapter. Okay. And this is also how we organize this course. Every week we talk about an individual topic. If you look at these words, okay, actually there is a relationship between the content of the word and the location of the word. For those human behavior on the left side, like language, thinking, memory, reasoning, creativity, perception, these behaviors, they could be replaced by machines, like language. Probably for human language, you probably still think that even for today, artificial intelligence still can't properly recognize or produce human language, but it's getting better now. At least nowadays, the artificial intelligence on language processing has been much better than like 10 years ago. And of course, in 10 years, it will be even better. So language is relatively easier to be replaced by machines or to be replaced by artificial intelligence. Or memory, of course memory. Machine can memorize things even better than you. And for most of the machines, their memories are generally accurate. Okay, for humans, we have learned about memory, false memories before. Like our memory system somehow, according to Elizabeth Loftus, is like Wikipedia. Anyone can change it. But for machines, probably it's much more accurate, much more efficient, okay, better than human. Perception, like vision. Can machine recognize like human faces or objects? For faces, probably nowadays for artificial intelligence, for this technique to recognize human faces, it's not 100% correct or perfect, but it's fair enough. It's not perfect, but it's getting better, and probably it will be even better in a few years. So perception somehow also could be replaced by artificial intelligence. In general, those behaviors on the left side, they somehow potentially could be replaced by machines or robots. But for those behavior on the right side, like emotion, motivation, or like interpersonal relationship, for these behaviors, probably they are harder to be replaced by machines. Also, you wouldn't want to create a robot that has emotions, because emotion something you wouldn't want a machine or a robot to have. So basically, no one would want to create a machine that has emotions. So for those behaviors on the right side, they are more unique to humans. Okay. And those are also topics we haven't covered yet, but we are going to touch them in a few weeks. From the beginning of the semester up to now, we have been focusing on those behaviors on the left side. Those behaviors on the left side, they have a common feature. That common feature is somehow they're easier to be replaced by machines. And they are also what cognitive psychologists are interested in. So if you go to any psychology department, if you look at their if you look at their curriculum, okay, how they design their courses, there is a very important subject, which is cognitive psychology. And what is cognitive psychology? Cognitive psychology basically is dealing with those human behaviors that potentially somehow could be replaced by artificial intelligence. And actually we have been talking a lot about cognitive psychology. We talked about memory before. We talked about perception before. We talked about attention before. But there are still some other topics that we haven't covered yet. And we are going to talk about them today. So today, we're going to talk about the rest of cognitive psychology. And from next week onward, we are shifting our focus to the right side of the human behavior, which are like emotion, motivations, or something more warm-blooded. Okay. But today, we're still on the left side. We have to talk about the rest of cognitive psychology. That was cognitive psychology. Probably you have seen this word in some magazines or newspapers or news, TV news. Probably you have seen the term cognitive science. And what is cognitive science? Cognitive science. Cognitive science is like this. If you look at the picture, it's a combination of many disciplines. It includes, of course, cognitive psychology and neuroscience. What is the difference between cognitive psychology and neuroscience? Or what is the difference between a cognitive psychologist and a neuroscientist? Basically, they are concerned about very similar topics. The topics could be, for example, intelligence, reading, attention, language. Okay. A psychologist, a cognitive psychologist could be interested in language processing. A neuroscientist could also be interested in language processing. But what's the difference between the two professionals is, for cognitive psychologists, we look at behavior. We mainly focus on behavior. Okay? We collect behavioral data and we try to find the cause of a certain behavior. So we look at, for cognitive psychologists, we look at human behavior. We focus on human behavior. But neuroscientists, they focus more on the physiology. Okay? They might be studying language, but they look at what part of the brain is dealing with language. So although they might look at the same topic, but they start with different focus. Cognitive psychologists start with behavior, but for neuroscientists, they start with the physiology. But they could be studying exactly the same topic. Or some people can be both. Some people, they could be a cognitive psychologist and also a neuroscientist. They are not exclusive. Okay. Computer science, what do they do in cognitive science? A computer scientist could potentially be interested in like human language processing. But for cognitive psychologists or for neuroscientists, they look at humans. It could be human behavior or it could be human physiology, but in any case, they are all humans. But for computer scientists, if they want to know the cognitive processing, the way they use, the methodology they use could be just computer simulations. They might write up a lot of algorithms. These are all mathematics formulas. They try to design some algorithm and they will run computer simulations and they will compare their simulations with behavioral data, and they might hypothesize that human cognitive system is working in a particular way because according to their simulations, those algorithms could explain human behavior. So basically, the materials they use are different. For computer scientists, the materials are mathematics, but for neuroscientists or for cognitive psychologists, the materials they use are from human beings. linguistics or linguists, what do they do in cognitive science? In a way, language processing or linguistics could somehow be part of cognitive psychology, but why are they separated from psychology? There could be a lot of potential reasons, but one of the reasons is actually if you compare language processing and other human behaviors, language is quite unique. Firstly, it seems that only human beings, only we have language, but for other animals, of course, they have perception, they have memory, somehow they have their reasoning skills, but somehow their language is not that complicated as ours. And also, if you look at the development of language, in general, most of the human abilities, they are getting better as you grow older. But for language, it doesn't seem like that. Somehow, like for learning a new language, somehow it's harder for older people than for younger people. So in many ways, language is very different from other human cognitive abilities. And that is probably one of the reasons why linguistics somehow is separated from the rest of cognitive psychology. But in a way, they are also studying the human mind. So of course, they are also part of cognitive science. Philosophy, what do philosophers do in cognitive science? What they generally do is they are looking at how other people study their topics and whether other people are using an appropriate method to study cognitive science. For example, a few weeks ago, we introduced functional MRI. Okay? Functional MRI is the machine. I also play a video. It is a machine, it's a big tube, and you are lying inside of the big tube. And that machine will scan your brain activity. Okay? And a very typical classical way to design a functional MRI experiment is, if you are, for example, if you want to study what part of the brain is doing reading, okay, what you could do is you just send a group of people into the functional MRI machine and they are reading something in the machine. And you compare another group of people who are also lying in the machine but they are doing something other than machine, other than reading. And you compare the difference between them in terms of their brain activities. And if you find a difference in a particular region of the brain, probably you would say that region is doing reading. But when you are designing this kind of experiment, basically you have an assumption. That assumption is there is a particular region in the brain that is processing reading, and you are looking for that region. But potentially, probably that kind of region doesn't exist. If that kind of region doesn't exist, actually it's meaningless if you are doing this kind of research with functional MRI machine. So basically, for other people, when people are studying a particular topic, they have some assumptions in their mind. And that assumption will affect how they design a research. And that assumption will affect how they interpret their data. And philosophers, they are really concerned about these assumptions. Are those assumptions valid? Are those assumptions correct? Are you using a valid way to study your question? Or you are studying a particular question, but does that question even exist? Probably you are studying something that doesn't exist. Okay? And those are things that philosophers are concerned about. They are actually standing on a higher location to sort of overlook, monitor how other people are doing their jobs correctly. Okay. So we are now going into the rest of cognitive psychology. First, we're going to talk about language use. Language and evolution. When speaking of language, some people, they might think that human beings, we, are the only species that has language. What about other animals, other species? Do they have languages? They might have something similar to languages, but not exactly the same, like bees. Bees, actually, they can communicate with each other. But how do they communicate with each other? They can dance. They have a particular way to move their body. With that kind of body movement, they can tell other bees where the food is. Okay, so they can communicate. Or if you have a cat or a dog, your pets, if you teach them to sit or to stand up, probably they can understand your instructions, but in a way it's kind of communication. Okay. So in terms of communication, actually we are not the only species that can communicate with each other. Like bees, like your cat or your dog, they can also communicate with you, or maybe somehow they can communicate with each other. So in terms of communication, they could communicate as well, but are their communication the same as our communications? Actually, there is a crucial difference between their communication and our communication. The difference is for bees, although they can communicate, but there is a limit in their communication. Basically, they can also tell other bees where the food is. So just the location. The only information that can communicate is the location of the food. That's it. That's all. They can't communicate anything further. Or even for your pets, it could be your cats or your dogs, probably you would think that they are clever, more clever than bees. They can understand something other than location of the food. They can understand sit down or stand up. Okay? They can understand more information, but in a way, it's also limited. But for human beings, basically, there is no limitation about what kind of information or how much, the quantity, the amount of information that we can communicate. Okay? There's no limitation. Okay? Because you can always combine old information to form a new information. You can always combine, you can always create new information. So there is no limitation in human languages, but there is limitations for communications in other animals. Okay. But of course, for human language, we have limited words. The number of words in every language is limited, but the information, because you can always recombine those words to form new message. So the message we can communicate is no limit. But there are still some people, they are very keen to investigate how other animals use language. Probably the best strategy is to start with some species that closer to us, like chimpanzees. Okay, 黑猩猩啊. And there have been some individual reports about chimpanzees being able to use human language. These are two of the most famous chimpanzees. They are Washu and Sarah. And for Washu, if you want to teach a chimpanzee to use human language, there is actually a limitation because we have different vocal systems. So you can't really teach a chimpanzee to talk like a human. It is not because of the limit on cognitive system. It is because of the limit on your vocal system. So you can't teach them to speak. So, of course, they can't speak. But even for human beings, we are not always speaking. For some people, they have some difficulty in speaking, so they will use sign language. So that's why they choose sign language, because for chimpanzees, they can't talk, but they can learn to use sign language, 手语啊. Washu, this chimpanzee could use simplified American Sign Language. For sign language, there are different sign languages as well, American or the Taiwanese. It's like language, because different regions in the world, they have different language. And the same situation also applies to sign languages. Different parts of the world, they have different sign languages. For this chimpanzee, he can he can use simplified American Sign Language. Okay. For the other chimpanzee, Sarah, she can use plastic symbols on a magnetic board. She doesn't use sign language, but in a way, it is very similar to a sign language. Okay. She just uses a board, and also she can learn the meaning of some symbols. Symbolic is actually a very important feature for human language. For example, in English, if you look at the word sun, the way you write the sun and the way you pronounce sun, basically it has nothing to do with the sun. Or even if you use another language, you use Chinese, 太阳, the sound of 太阳and also the shape of 太阳, they have nothing to do with the actual sun. And this is symbolic. Okay. This is one crucial feature in human language. They are all symbolic. The word you use, no matter how you pronounce it, no matter how you write it, they have nothing to do with the actual object. Okay. This seems to be quite easy for us, but it's not that easy for other animals. But for chimpanzees, they can do it. If you teach a chimpanzee that this indicates water, this indicates fire. Also, this has nothing to do with water. This has nothing to do with fire. They can learn it. I mean, chimpanzees can learn it. So in a way, they can process symbols as humans do. Or like bonobos, 侏儒黑猩猩, Kanzi and Malika, okay, they can also acquire plastic symbols like this. The shape of the symbol, they don't have actually, they could be irrelevant to the actual objects they refer to. So they don't really need any physical similarity. And for bonobos, they can learn the meaning of symbols. But if you compare their language use and our language use, a crucial difference is, for us, we can produce unlimited number of messages by following a particular rules. Those rules are grammar. Okay. But for other animals like chimpanzees or bonobos, it's really quite hard for them to acquire any kind of grammar. So for human language, if you take English as an example, if you say, I hit you and you hit me, basically when you are saying the two messages, they both involve three individuals, you, me, and hit. But they mean different things. Because according to English grammar, the subject has to be before the verb and the object is after the verb. The same rule also applies to Chinese. So if you swap the location of the subject and the object, the meaning will change. But for them, for bonobos, they can't acquire these. It's just too difficult for them. They can understand what is you, what is I, what is hit, but they can't just change the meaning by swapping their locations. For them, they will be confused. So that is one of the crucial differences between our language and the language of other animals. Okay. For grammar use, so far it's still unique to human beings. But of course, you can always find new evidence suggesting that animals can learn language as humans do. Because if you are really into this kind of topic, whether or how other animals acquire languages, because you can't exhaust all the animals, because there are so many animals, and for each animal there are so many individuals, unless you can investigate every single individual of them. Otherwise, it's really hard to know whether exactly we are the only species that has language. But so far, according to those published studies that people have observed, so far, it seems that humans are the only species that has languages. Okay? By language, it means that you can use symbolic symbol to produce unlimited messages. For this kind of ability, we are the only species that can do it. Okay? But even for human languages, there is more than one language for humans to use. There are thousands of languages in the world. And so some people, they believe that when people are using different languages, they are also thinking in different ways. Okay? So this is our next topic, language, thought, and culture. Can language shape our thought and culture? Okay. If you believe that the language you use can change the way you think, then it means that you are a believer of linguistic relativity. 语言相对论. So linguistic relativity, the language an individual speaks has an impact on the way the individuals think about the world. And let's have a look at this interesting video about linguistic relativity. Okay, this is a very classical example about how language shape your thoughts. In our language, like in Chinese or in English, we use left to right a lot. Basically, we use ourselves as the reference point. But it's not like every language is like that. Some languages, they don't have left to right. They just have like east, west, south, and north. So when you're describing the location of a particular object, you have to really know where exactly it is. It's on the east side or west side. Okay? And somehow, some people will believe that actually they have a better spatial skills. And this guy, Keith Chin, he is actually a professor in economics. And he sort of proposed a theory that the language that you use can affect your economic behavior. What kind of behavior? Saving behavior. Okay, this is also another an example that people talk a lot. Like in Chinese, we have many terms to describe the interpersonal relationship in a family. But in other languages, it's different. Okay, there are not that many terms, so maybe it changes the way we look at our relatives in our family, probably. But my personal feeling is, although we have a lot of different terms, but actually when you are using those terms, sometimes they are not that easy. You have to really think. 叔叔伯伯阿姨外甥侄子 those terms, although we have separate terms, but it's not something will come instantly to your mind. You have to really think about it. If you have to think about it, probably it doesn't mean that it's our nature. According to this Professor Chen, he believes that because every language has their different grammar. Some languages he call them future languages, which means that if you have to talk about something in the future, you have to use it could be a different tense, or you have to add something into your speak. Those languages are future languages. But for some other languages, when you are talking about something in the future, basically you don't need to change anything, and those languages are futureless languages. And he believed that if your language is a futured language, you are thinking about the future differently. For you, the present could be separate from the future. So you tend not to save money that much because you're actually living at the present. You don't think about the future that much, so you don't save money that much. This is his logic. But if your language is futureless language, for you, future equals to the present. So you tend to save more money because for you, like the present and the future, they're continuous. So you tend to worry about the future more. So you tend to save money more. Okay, that is his theory. Okay. And it's a theory. Of course, you have to provide evidence to support your theory. For linguistic relativity, it's really hard to do an experiment. Probably you can, because you can't, it's really hard to manipulate the language a person uses. If you can't manipulate something, then you can't do an experiment. You can only do a correlational study, and he did do a correlational study. He collected data from different language users and their saving behaviors, and he calculated the correlation, and he did find a correlation. And this kind of correlation not only exists globally, he also finds evidence like even within a country that supposedly if people are living in the same country, they have very similar cultures and they have very similar legal system. Even for a small country like Switzerland, because there are 4 official languages and some of the languages are featured, some of the languages are featureless, he also finds a correlation between whether this language has a future tense and how people save their money. And not only for saving behaviors, also for other behaviors, obesity and birth control. Okay, so this is linguistic relativity, but something you have to bear in mind that this kind of research is a correlational study, so you don't know, even the correlation exists, but you don't know whether it is because the language that shaped their behavior, or maybe it's the opposite way, like it is because they have different behaviors and that affect how they use the language. Okay, we don't know which one is the cause, which one is the effect. But anyway, this kind of theory, if you believe that language can shape your thoughts, then you are a believer of linguistic relativity. But for this kind of theory, probably because you can't do an experiment, you can only run a correlational study, so it's really hard to really find a piece of evidence that can 100% perfectly support this theory. Also, it is also really hard to disprove this theory, because somehow it's easier to prove something exists, but it's just harder to prove something doesn't exist. So I could only show you the positive evidence, like the video I just showed you, but it's hard to think about, an example that can disprove it. Okay. Okay, there is some other evidence, like these people, Piraha people. They live in Amazon regions in Brazil, and in their language they only have 3 terms to describe quantity, like the 3 terms. And they mean small amount, somewhat larger amount, many. So compared to other languages, they have fewer terms to describe the quantity. And if you test their memory performance, indeed, they are not very good at remembering quantities over a brief delay. Okay? But when you're looking at this kind of study, you also have to be cautious, because usually if you are asking people to do something, it's really hard. You have to use their language to ask them to do something. So when you are using their language, somehow you have limited their task performance. Although what you want to measure is their cognitive performance. But in a way, when you are giving them instructions, you are using their language. So probably the reason why they perform worse, it is not because they can't think about different quantities. It's just because they can't use a medium to express their capacity of memorizing quantities, because they can only rely on their language to express their memorization capacity in quantities. Okay. So this is also one of the things that you have to be cautious when you are looking at that evidence that shows language can affect your thinking. It could be due to because you are actually using their language to test their cognitive capacity. And if you can't find a particular ability, that it is not because they don't have that ability. It's just because maybe they do have that ability, but they can't perform that ability with their language. Okay. But anyway, that was language, and we are going to revisit this topic again. Actually, next week, not in a few weeks. Okay, next week we are going to talk about developmental psychology. So that was language. Next topic, creativity. Okay. We all know what creativity is. And this is a definition of creativity. Individuals' ability to generate ideas that it has to be novel, new, and it has to be appropriate. You can't just create a random idea. It has to be practical. This is a general creativity, but it's really hard to quantify this ability. And when people are talking about creativity, actually it involves two kinds of thinkings. The first one is divergent thinking. What is divergent thinking? For example, if I give you a question, the question is square. If I want you to imagine as many things as possible that are relevant to a square, okay, and you write down as many as possible. The more you write, the more creative you are. This kind of thinking is divergent thinking, and you can find this kind of tasks in like intelligence tests or creativity tests. It is one part of creativity, but it is not everything of creativity. Creativity also involves another thinking strategy, convergent thinking. What is convergent thinking? I give you three words: cottage, Swiss, and cake. And could you find any word that is relevant to all of them? Okay. Can anyone think of a word?
Cheese.
Okay. Yeah, cheese. But of course, this is not a single answer. Like a vacation could also potentially be an answer to this question. But anyway, this kind of thinking, you try to find a rule among those seemingly irrelevant things. This kind of thinking is convergent thinking, and it is also part of creativity. For creativity, actually my feeling is it's not like memory. For memory, there is a very important theory, like the working memory theory. If you still remember that, that big structure, when people are thinking about working memory, people are thinking about that structure. Like working memory has three subsystems: spatial system, phonological system, and episodic system. It has a very well-established theory. But for creativity, my feeling is there hasn't been a very well-structured theory. But there have been some data. According to those data, how to improve our creativity. Okay. These are three pieces of advice that is written in the textbook. The first one, multicultural experience. The second one, thinking about distant future. The third one, additive counterfactual thoughts. The first one, multicultural experience, probably is easier to understand. The more multicultural experiences you have, the more creative you are. It seems to be somehow common sense, but in psychology, actually psychology is full of common senses, but you have to provide evidence to support your common sense. And there is evidence. So in this study, there is a pretest stage and a test stage. In the pretest stage, there are two groups of subjects. And those subjects, they are viewing a PowerPoint presentation, just like this kind of PowerPoint presentation. One of the groups, they are looking at a presentation about Chinese culture. This study was done in America. Okay? And the second group, they were also viewing a presentation, but that presentation was about American and Chinese culture side by side. So on the PowerPoint, on the one side it is the Chinese culture, on the other side it is the American culture. So there are two groups. Okay. So apparently the second group is the multicultural group. The first group is the unicultural group. After this pretest of viewing a presentation, in the test stage, they had to create a story, but it is a creative version of the Cinderella story. Almost everyone knows about Cinderella, but you have to rewrite this story to make it more 灰姑娘, to make it more creative. After they have written stories, you need another group of independent judges. Those judges will judge how creative those stories are. And according to their results, which is not too surprising, the second group is more creative because the second group is more multicultural. Okay. Second one, thinking about distant future and what is it? There are also two groups of subjects, and those subjects, they were asked to think to imagine their future. Two kinds of future. The first kind, tomorrow, they have to think about what they are going to do tomorrow. The other group, they have to think about what they are going to do in 1 year. And after this future thinking task, there is another test, which is a scenario that Miss Miller likes her plants. Please help her find ways to decorate her room. So you have to use plants to decorate a room. And of course, you have a group of independent judges. Those judges will evaluate how creative your decoration is. And according to their result, the 1 year group is more creative. So if you can think about something more distant in the future, it actually somehow can improve your creativity. The first two strategies, multicultural experience, thinking about distant future, probably is not too surprising. The third one is more counterintuitive, additive counterfactual thoughts. What is additive counterfactual? In this study, also you need two groups of subjects. The first group, they have to construct an additive counterfactual. What is an additive counterfactual? Counterfactual means something opposite to facts. And for additive one, additive counterfactual means something you've never done, but you imagine if you had done it. Like for you guys, you are university students. Supposedly you are not working. So if I want you to imagine if you were working, how would it be like? That kind of imaginations are additive counterfactuals. Something you have never done, but I want you to imagine if you had done it, what would happen? And there is another counterfactual, which is the opposite. Something you have done it already, but I want you to imagine that if you hadn't done it. Like for you guys, you are university students, and I want you to imagine that if you hadn't come to this university. So apparently you have come to this university, something you have done it already, but I want you to imagine if you hadn't done it, what would happen? This kind of counterfactual thinking is subtractive counterfactual. Now have a guess. Which kind of thinking, which kind of counterfactual thinking can improve your creativity? The result is, according to them, and of course you need a creativity task, and this task is just like a Lego brick making task. The result is additive group is better than subtractive group. You haven't done something, but if you imagine that you had done it, this kind of thinking can improve your creativity. So that was creativity. Basically, there hasn't been a very clear theory, but there are some data